Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first event of the 2022 Invited Speaker Seminar Series of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. My name is Alessandro Corda. I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Law and the current director of the ICCJ. Today's event is titled A Comparative Discussion on Police Reform After George Floyd. Where do we go from here? Featuring a stellar lineup of speakers. As the theme and the speakers suggest, the Institute maintains a broad interdisciplinary status. While the ICCJ is housed within the School of Law here at Queen's, its membership includes researchers from across the university, in particular from the School of Social Sciences, Education, and Social Work. In this regard, before we get started, I would like to turn it over to Professor Shad Maruna, who is the ICCJ co-director and lead of the criminology group within the School of Social Sciences. Shad, to you.
Hey, thanks for that. I just want to say hello to everybody. It's been a long time since we've been together as an ICCJ, so really delighted to see all the names on the side of my screen and all the faces of our guests and of course and John, always fantastic to hear from you on the screen, and most importantly, I just wanted to say thank you to Alessandro for putting this together today and for putting together a really incredible series of these events going forward the rest of this semester. Some of you have heard already that Ruben Miller is going to have to delay his the annual lecture, but we're still hoping to hear from him either this year or next. But the main thing is it's fantastic to get these sessions back, and that's all thanks to Alessandro. So look forward to today, and good luck. Good seeing you all.
So, Shad, thank you very much. Too kind of you, really. In this event today, we'll be focusing on the experiences, discourses, and ongoing reform efforts on the matter of police reform on both sides of the pond, with the goal of bridging conversations about policing and engage in a fruitful cross-national conversation. So the format will be that each speaker will have about 15 minutes. I will start by broadly asking each of them a question, and then we'll have the conversation started. So our first guest speakers today is Jennifer Cobina. I can still see Jennifer on the call. So Jennifer is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Her research primarily focuses on public response to police use of force, as well as on prisoner reentry and the understanding of recidivism and resistance among recently released female offenders. She's a stellar scholar. In 2021, she was awarded the Albert J. Rice Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award from the Crime, Law, and Deviance section of the American Sociological Association in recognition of her fantastic book published in 2019 by NYU Press, titled Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. So, Jennifer, to start our conversation this afternoon, my question for you would really be the following. So how have recent protests against police misconduct and killings before and after George Floyd's murder and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US influenced and changed the conversation about police reform and activism? Thank you very much once again.
Thank you for the question. And I just want to confirm that we have about 15 minutes to respond. Is that
yes,
correct, Alessandro? Okay, thank you. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate all those who are on the call right now. I'll go ahead and respond to that question in a moment, but I just first want to say that acts of injustice against, Black people, particularly, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and countless others, are all examples of state violence that so many Black people have encountered historically in the United States. And we also know that violence, protests, and demonstrations are not new. In many ways, the massive protests that have taken place in the past couple of years resemble the protests that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths in 2014 and 2015, respectively. The deaths of both of these young Black men we know accelerated the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in 2013 after the murder acquittal of George Zimmerman and the death of Trayvon Martin, who at the time was a 17-year-old African-American boy. And so because many African Americans, they were tired of the extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and self-declared vigilantes, this movement unfolded as a call for action, demanding change with how police deal with racial ethnic minorities, and also calling for an end to systemic racism that exists in the United States. And so the deaths of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, we know, were two of several high-profile police killings that really gave impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. And protests at each of these sites really brought up decades of pent-up emotions of anger and frustration and outrage from much of the Black community. And so the city of Ferguson was a flashpoint for nationwide protests since the killing of Michael Brown, who was unarmed and also fatally killed by a white police officer from the Ferguson Police Department. And so 2 to 3 months following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths, I conducted nearly 200 interviews with protesters and residents of Ferguson and Baltimore. And large amounts of protesters and a large amount of people took to the streets because they believed that Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were victims of injustice and that these were not isolated incidents. Either they themselves had been victims of racial profiling, surveillance, police harassment, or violence, or they knew family members, friends, and neighbors who were recipients of such acts by law enforcement. And so residents explicitly tie their involvement in protesting to broader patterns of criminalization that have led to heightened police scrutiny of Black civilians. In addition, there were many who felt an overwhelming obligation to demonstrate, as they understood that failure to do so would result in more Black individuals dying at the hands of law enforcement. And so among the activists that I interviewed, the desire to achieve change and put an end to police violence and systemic racism were all central factors to protest participation. However, it was not uncommon for protesters who were on the front lines to become recipients of more repressive, militaristic police tactics. Even though thousands of people took to the streets to protest treatment by the state, the government sent more police with high-powered weapons and military tanks. Law enforcement used tear gas, rubber bullets, physical force, armored vehicles, and large-scale arrests on a number of demonstrators. And protesters viewed these actions as being aggressive in nature with an intent to intimidate. And so those who protested on the front lines were more vocal about denouncing police violence and those who challenged the authority of law enforcement were more likely to experience and witness repressive police action. Some protesters were impacted by physical and psychological trauma, of course, of police tactics. And even in the midst of protesters decrying the killings of Black individuals by law enforcement, many continued to experience heavy-handed military tactics that were used on them, despite the fact that the vast majority of protests were peaceful. In fact, in many cases, violence was catalyzed by police tactics, and we know that force begets force. So the more repressive the police were, the more some protesters also developed resistance and became much more civically engaged in an effort to root out systemic racism and put an end to police violence that continued to rob so many Black people of their lives. And so the protests in both Ferguson and Baltimore changed the landscape considerably regarding activism. Social media played a critical role in the activism efforts and continues to play a role even in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. Social media has been used to tell the story of the victims of police killings. It's been used to share information about protest events that are not filtered by mainstream media. Social media allows activists to go directly to the people and to amplify their voices. It's used to so social media is heavily used to organize and communicate in real time. It's used to publicize information about ongoing protest events and also serves as an educational tool for those outside of the movement. So Ferguson and Baltimore protests have fundamentally changed America in very real ways. For instance, they have brought to the forefront the issue of race, racism, and policing in the United States. It's helped also to shed light on the issues of police brutality, and it's also humanized the victims. It's also helped to expose widespread monetized abuse of poor minorities by entire local criminal justice system, particularly in Ferguson. The police and the courts strategically, it was found by the Department of Justice that they strategically targeted Black people for arrests and fines to add millions of dollars into their city coffers. The protests have also shed light on racial and class inequities within the criminal legal system. It's led to increased conversations and debates regarding police violence amongst academics, police unions, politicians, and the general public. And it's also resulted in civilian bystanders using their cell phones to record police interactions with civilians. It has also, we know, impacted political conversations, and it has also moved the needle towards police reform ideas, such as defunding the police that was previously viewed as radical. Because many, and so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So because many activists remained pessimistic about the possibility of successful reform of police, many have called for reinvestments of federal dollars to education, employment, and social services in marginalized communities, which has been shown to improve community safety. The idea behind defunding the police reflects a desire for a massive restructuring of public spending priorities. It's not punishment, but rather it is the reallocation or redirection of funding away from police departments to other government agencies. Defunding is not about abolishing the police. It's not even about starting over and disbanding. Its concern instead is with the efficient allocation of public resources. Specifically, it calls for a permanent reduction to existing policing. Such calls are made for several reasons. First, we've tried to figure out various ways to train the police, from implicit bias training to de-escalation training to diversity training. And even though, calls for police training always seem to follow controversial police-civilian interactions, we know virtually nothing about the short or long-term effects associated with police training of any type. But statistics show us that 1,000 men, women, and children are killed each year by the police, and thousands more are brutalized and abused. Second, handling violent crime accounts for approximately 4% of police officers' time at work. The vast majority of arrests are for low-level, nonviolent activities in encounters that sometimes escalate to deadly force. These activities are often symptoms of underlying issues of drug addiction, homelessness, and mental illness, which should be treated by healthcare professionals and social workers rather than the police. Third, America spends more than $100 billion on policing every single year. According to data from the Urban Institute, from 1977 to 2017, state and local government spending on police increased from $42 billion to $115 billion. While at the same time, there have been cuts to social services, education, community resources, and services. Police departments are usually the largest department in a city budget and usually take anywhere from 25 to 45% or more of the general funds in major cities. Ultimately, outsized spending increases on policing are draining resources from everywhere else. Fourth, while police budgets remain bloated, the clearance rates for violent crime is quite abysmal. The FBI's uniform crime reporting shows that 40% of homicides go unsolved every single year. 66% of rapes go unsolved. 70% of robberies and nearly 50% of aggravated assaults go unsolved each year. Finally, years of research shows no strong correlation between police funding and crime. Over time, over the past 60 years, more spending on state and local police has not been significantly correlated with less crime or more crime. And so proponents of defund the police ask questions such as, should police respond to all types of 911 calls? Could they be more effective in apprehending lawbreakers if they weren't tied up with trivial or non-criminal incidents? If money is taken from policing, where can and should it go? Should it go to other government agencies? Should it go to social service providers? And so the idea behind defunding the police is that there should be massive restructuring of public spending priorities. And we all know that defunding the police has been quite controversial. However, I do want to state that there are some commonalities between police and activists when it comes to reimagining the role of police. The reality is that we depend on police to solve every societal problem. We look to the police to solve issues of abuse, abandonment, homelessness, unemployment, domestic disputes, school disruptions, and a host of other societal problems. And many officers themselves will admit that we unfairly look to them to solve all of societal ills and that they are not well suited to deal with certain issues pertaining to drug overdose and mental health addiction. Calls to 911 for mental health crisis and problems related to homelessness, substance abuse, and petty interpersonal disputes consume huge amounts of policing resources and can lead to violence, repetitive cycles of 911 calls, and imprisonment. And that's because underlying problems do not get solved. So governments should be thinking about how to give community resources so that they do not have to call the police for every societal problem. In communities that have low crime rates, we do not see heavy police presence. These neighborhoods are well off, they're well connected, and they're well resourced. In contrast, communities that have high rates of crime, that's where we also see structural disadvantage, pervasive inequality, joblessness, poverty, and inadequate public services. Increased efforts should be made to diminish economic deprivation by promoting stable housing, rehabilitating deteriorated houses, enhancing social and physical disorder, improving municipal services, and building human capital. So these kinds of investments within marginalized communities can aid in reversing concentrated disadvantage and help to stabilize neighborhoods. When we place larger investments into marginalized communities, it will play a potent role in crime reduction and prevention, and ultimately reduce our need to heavily rely on law enforcement in the first place. So shockingly, little is known about how or whether diverting police resources to other government agencies or outside of government could be accomplished. Are there other entities more capable of picking up where police leave off? How would certain types of calls be diverted or shared with other agencies? However, there are some examples such as CAHOOTS, standing for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. This is a program that's being done in Eugene, Oregon, which handles approximately 20% of 911 calls. So they started taking a different approach to dealing with nonviolent incidents caused by someone experiencing mental illness, addiction, or homelessness. Instead of sending armed officers to respond, the city dispatches crisis responders to diffuse the situation and to connect the individual with services that he or she needs. Specifically, they dispatch a nurse or EMT alongside an experienced mental health worker for calls such as welfare checks, mental health episodes, public intoxication, or even death notices. And so according to their estimates, they've saved the city millions in police and emergency room resources. There are also some innovative approaches that communities have been exploring to promote safety and well-being outside of policing. Advanced Peace is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to ending cyclical and retaliatory gun violence by investing in the development, the health, and the well-being of people who are most likely to be perpetrators of gun violence. At the core of Advanced Peace is the Peacemakers Fellowship, which is a personalized program that provides transformational opportunities to young individuals involved in lethal firearm offenses. So this organization offers those in the program daily mentoring and supportive relationships. They also use street outreach workers to deliver services and support and provide support to these individuals during an 18-month program. And so Advanced Peace focuses on building trust and healing relationships with those who are at the center of urban gun violence. And it recognizes the trauma that they've also experienced are often contributing to their use of firearms. And so the organization also recognizes that people who engage in or who are harmed by urban gun violence are young individuals of color living in communities with long histories of structural racism, divestment, and isolation from law enforcement, social services, and education. And so rather than rely on law enforcement to communicate messages against gun violence, Advanced Peace relies on street outreach workers who use their skills to build meaningful relationships while also working with community-based organizations. Outcome evaluations of Advanced Peace show positive results in Richmond, Stockton, and Sacramento, California, including substantial reductions in shootings involving death or injury in all three cities. Ultimately, Advanced Peace is creating an environment of healing, affirmation, and harm reduction that invests time, attention, and services that are tailored to meet the needs, the experiences, and the realities of those who are a part of this peacemaking fellowship program. And so this results in new life opportunities, personal and leadership development, as well as healing for those who are so often ignored or marginalized in communities of color. So the result is a reduction in gun violence. So in conclusion, if we want to see violent prevention and reduction take place, then increased efforts should also be made to diminish economic deprivation by promoting stable and affordable housing, investing in high quality public schools, providing living wage jobs, improving municipal services, and providing social programs. These kinds of investments within marginalized communities can aid in reversing concentrated disadvantage and stabilize neighborhoods because their needs are now being met. And when we place large investments into marginalized communities, it can play a powerful role in crime reduction and prevention, and again, ultimately reduce our need to heavily rely on law enforcement in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for this very comprehensive and thoughtful reflections. I think that we'll be able to pick up on some of these topics during our Q&A and discussion after each presentation. So now our second guest speaker is Michelle Phelps. Michelle Phelps is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on the sociology of punishment, mass probation, criminal justice, transformation, and policing. So she's another stellar scholar by all measurements. Her work has been widely published in top interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals, and she's also the author with Phil Goodman and Josh Page of Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And she's currently working on a second book, tentatively titled Policing the Progressive City, Race, Violence, and the Future of Public Safety in Minneapolis. So, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. And I have a question for you as well to start out the conversation. So Minneapolis has become really the national testing ground of the defund the police or even abolish and replace the police movement across the US following George Floyd's murder in May of 2020. But what happens now? So both locally and nationally. In November, in Minneapolis, question 2 was defeated on the ballot. So this was a question which sought to replace the Minneapolis Police Department with the new Department of Public Safety. And what happens now with rising crime rates reported in major American cities? So where we are when it comes to the police reform movement and the post-George Floyd murder in the current landscape of American criminal justice. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here, and to everyone for the invitation, and thank you too to Jennifer for getting us started. I think Jennifer's talk is a great jumping off point for me to kind of zoom in on this whole trajectory from the Ferguson protests through to the conversation in summer 2020 in the more narrow context of what was happening in Minneapolis. And I think putting that in kind of conversation with the national discourses and what was happening in Ferguson and Baltimore is really helpful for us understanding these processes. So as everybody here knows, George Floyd was murdered on Memorial Day in summer 2020 in Minneapolis, about 15 blocks from where I'm sitting talking to you today from Minneapolis. 3 officers kneeled on his neck, back, and legs for more than 9 minutes as he lost consciousness, while a 4th officer taunted an increasingly distraught group of witnesses. Protests emerged in the city overnight and gained strength, culminating in 3 days of rebellion, much like we saw in Ferguson, except this time around in Minneapolis, folks on the street successfully burned down the police precinct where the police responsible for George Floyd's murder had worked out of, and also torched a local business corridor. And there were several days, like in Ferguson, the National Guard was eventually called in. There was a great deal of police violence during the protests. And ultimately things subsided, but only with a great deal of state force and a huge number of complaints against the police, and also PTSD claims on behalf of police officers who were active during the rebellion or the unrest or the uprising, depending on your preferred terminology. Importantly, within 2 weeks of the murder, police abolition groups in Minneapolis, which had emerged out of the BLM protests but considered themselves distinct from BLM, had campaigned a group of 9 of our 13 city council members to take to the stage at Powderhorn Park. Most of you, I think, have seen this photo. They were standing on a platform. Below the platform, the words "defund police" were written in giant block letters. And the city council members, which constituted a quote unquote veto-proof majority, meaning that even if the mayor overturned their decision on city council, that they could then block the mayor's veto, they declared that they were ready to end the Minneapolis Police Department, I'll call it MPD hereafter, and that MPD could not be reformed, and instead it needed to be replaced. Here, of course, I'm talking to you in 2022. I almost said 2021, 2022. MPD is still very much intact and has not been defunded. And so today I want to talk a little bit about both sides of that coin, right? Why do we get to this unprecedented statement? And then why do we get to the kind of return of the status quo, or the continuation of the status quo? Or is that how we should be thinking about this moment in Minneapolis? So as Alessandro noted, as all of this was happening, I actually had just wrapped up a big project on policing, anti-police violence activism, and police reform in Minneapolis that I'd started in 2016 with really little awareness of how much Minneapolis would come to take the center stage in the years that followed. This project included dozens of interviews with neighborhood residents, oral histories with activists, city leaders, and other sort of community and political representatives, as well as ethnographic observations at dozens of public events and meetings that were open to me and or the public. And as I started to write these papers together with a team of graduate students, we sort of realized, as everything happened in summer 2020, that the story wasn't over, and that in fact all of the data that we collected in 2016, 2017, and 2019 really helped to shed light on how we get to that declaration at Powderhorn and what it means and why the ballot initiative doesn't pass in 2021. So today I want to make three interrelated claims. Number one, I want to argue that we got to the Powderhorn Statement because of years of BLM activism, which at the time appeared to be failing at changing policing, right? There was a lot of, as Jennifer noted, a lot of skepticism among activists about whether reforms would actually work during this sort of initial period of contestation. But in fact, what I'll show is that those efforts were really seeding the ground for later changes and make the Powderhorn Statement possible. And so I think what this tells us is that the end result of activism needs to be measured over longer periods, right? Not just months and in the year following that activism, but over this longer time horizon. Second, I'm going to argue that the charter amendment failed because activists, city leaders, and everyday residents in the city disagreed about what exactly the charter change would do and whether it would lead to safety, but not because of their opinions about satisfaction with or against MPD, right? Largely, the city was very unsatisfied with MPD, and yet there was this really complicated debate over what's called question 2, because it was the second ballot question on the 2021 November vote. And then number 3, I want to argue that despite question 2 not passing, it did get 44% of the vote, which I think would have been hard to imagine several years prior. And all of the people and groups that were fighting to transform policing are still here in the city today. And the city is still changing even without the charter amendment passing. And I'll talk a bit about that in the end of my remarks. Okay, so first of all, to map out kind of the history of activism very quickly of the sort of what builds the ground for that Powderhorn Statement. So during the first wave of BLM protests in 2014, 2015, and 2016, Minneapolis was rocked by a series of policing scandals. Probably most notable was the 2015 killing of Jamar Clark, a Black man in North Minneapolis, by 2 officers who were called to respond to an altercation between Clark and EMT personnel who were attempting to take a woman to the hospital. Clark was unarmed and shot point blank as the officers sat on top of him. Clark's death and the ones that followed galvanized protesters in the city. BLM Minneapolis had started as solidarity protests with Ferguson, but that chapter and a number of other groups, including the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, emerged in the wake of the Jamar Clark death, and it really galvanized local BLM protests. And at that time, the department was in a period of deep reforms. They were part of the National Initiatives Project, which was an attempt to take the principles outlined in the Task Force on 21st Century Policing convened under Obama, and try to implement them through a series of policy reforms, reconciliation processes with community leaders, and trainings for officers, including those implicit bias and procedural justice trainings that Jennifer mentioned briefly a minute ago. But activists, as these reforms were continuing, and just a little asterisk here, when I talk about activists, in Jennifer's book, there's this great delineation of different kinds of activists, sort of the more casual protesters or the tourists, all the way to the revolutionaries. When I use the term activist, I don't really mean protester. If I'm talking about just people going to protest, I'll say protest. When I talk about activists, I'm primarily referring to the folks who were leading protests, who were organizing protests, who were helming these activist organizations. So they're really kind of the grass tops of these movements, rather than sort of the everyday protesters. So these activists or community leaders often derided these reforms as quote unquote phony solutions that would pacify the public without actually fundamentally changing the power relationships between police and citizens. So the officers, for instance, who were responsible for killing Clark were never disciplined. In fact, the chief sort of publicly exonerated them, saying she supported their actions. They were never prosecuted, either criminally or federally, and they didn't even face any discipline on the job. So in response, activists started to call for more radical or transformational changes, including things like requiring officers to carry individual liability insurance to cover the costs of police brutality, or civilian control of the police, both of which ran against state laws that made those impossible to enact given the legal structures. So by about 2017, activists largely appeared to have failed to influence policing in Minneapolis. And there was a sense in the activist field of this kind of pessimism, right? That nothing fundamentally had changed. Around the same time, the BLM chapter starts to disband, folks move on to other things. But out of that disbanding comes a trio of new activist groups that don't supplant the old activist groups, but sort of continue to sort of diversify the activist field. So you still have the same folks who are fighting for these more radical changes in police accountability structures, but at the same time, you get this trio of abolitionist groups who are really committed to using police defunding as a route towards eventually abolishing police altogether in Minneapolis. And it's that trio of organizations, it's MPD 150, Reclaim the Block, and Black Visions, who then come to take the lead for the Powderhorn Declaration. And in fact, literal text from the Powderhorn Declaration is pulled directly from the MPD report published in 2017. They're called MPD 150 because they published this report on the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department, saying, quote, the roots of police brutality, corruption, and racism are in the history and founding mission of police, end quote. So the US police system, they argue, is not reformable. And that language then pushes forward the Powderhorn Statement. This group, particularly Reclaim the Block, also becomes central in creating an Office of Violence Prevention program, which is designed to implement these community-based violence interruption programs that we just heard about a moment ago in the city. Those also, again, take center stage in 2020. So all of this activism in 2017 and 2018 really sets the stage for that declaration in 2020. So that takes us to the Charter Amendment. So the Charter Amendment, the city council members take the stage. They say, we're going to end the MPD. They quickly realize they can't actually do that because the mayor has almost exclusive control of the MPD, given the way the city charter is written. So they decide to put it up for a vote and to let the residents decide through this popular ballot initiative. The first attempt in 2020 stalls out. I can talk about the Q&A, why it's not super important, but it gets revived in 2021. And it's framed as a defunding initiative, but it actually says, in terms of the actual legal changes that it makes to the city's charter or the operating or governing documents of the city, it doesn't really defund anything. What it does is it literally strikes out all of the text about MPD, and that text had included that the mayor had exclusive control, which matters because at this point, the mayor is less on board with defunding than the average voter on the city council. And it required a mandatory minimum number of officers, something that the Police Federation, the union here, had fought for decades before. So in the new charter language, instead of the MPD, it would be a Department of Public Safety. It wouldn't be under exclusive mayoral control, and it wouldn't have that mandatory minimum, which meant that a lawsuit that a number of residents had filed saying the city was inadequately protecting them due to low staffing levels that were too low, that were below that minimum, would have been tossed out. Instead, because question 2 doesn't pass, the city is currently under court order to hire more than 150 officers in the coming year. But in the days leading up to the vote even, it was unclear exactly what this change would mean. Some people thought that it meant that all officers would have to reapply for their job. The language of the charter amendment was that the new department would include police officers if necessary. Well, by state law, they were necessary. So de facto, there would be police officers in the new department, but it wasn't clear legally what would happen to officers who are currently in MPD, or what would happen with the union contract, whether those things would transfer over to the new department or not. So it created a massive amount of, I can't see that card, but I'm assuming it says 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Oh, great. That's more than I thought I had. Great. So it created a massive amount of political conflict dominating the 2021 election. Supporters of the question, banded under the Yes for Minneapolis campaign, garnered substantial support, including from a Soros Foundation grant. The opposition had which called themselves All of Minneapolis, had the support of the police chief, the mayor, and many downtown business interests. Both aggressively campaigned for and against question 2. But by the time the city goes to vote on question 2, of course, things look really different than they did in summer 2020. The city was 1.5 years into the COVID pandemic. And as Alessandro noted, in Minneapolis, as in many other cities across the US, there had been a spate of gun violence, including a really lethal couple of months in the summer where several very young children in North Minneapolis had been shot and killed by stray gunfire. The city, as I mentioned, had also lost a number of officers to PTSD claims, so the force was down by about 1/3. And while there's no clean line between all of the contestation over MPD and the increase in violence in the city, that line was certainly drawn by the All of Minneapolis campaigners to try and stoke fear about what the coming charter amendment might do in terms of public safety. So in the end, the vote broke down 56 to 44. What's interesting is that precincts in North Minneapolis, which have the highest concentration of Black voters in the city, voted no on average, but they were close to the overall city vote. The strongest no votes were in the predominantly white, very wealthy neighborhoods, whereas the highest rate of yes votes were in the younger neighborhoods, younger skewing neighborhoods, especially around the University of Minnesota, and in the multiracial neighborhoods with a lot of young voters. So the question 2 winds up getting read as this sort of referendum on what Black residents wanted in the city, with both sides claiming that they were the authentic voices of what would be good for the safety of Black residents. When we think about safety, both as safety from community violence and safety from police violence. But in fact, the data show, and many of my interviews from earlier show, that neither Black residents nor white residents were a monolith, and that for Black residents in particular, this coupling of feeling trapped between police violence and community violence created a lot of ambivalence about what the charter amendment would do and whether it would actually lead to more safety in their communities. Okay, so that takes me to the future. So again, 44% of the population voted for this thing that was fear-mongered, at least, as abolition overnight, right? Replacing the MPD department with a new department, which would include police officers. So it's not really going to no police overnight, but it would have been a big change. 45%, almost 45% of voters agreed with that. So that enthusiasm in Minneapolis and the activist coalitions, which got a massive number of millions of dollars in donations in 2020, they aren't going anywhere. And I am sure that there will be votes in the future on the kind of continuation of MPD, especially removing that mandatory minimum number of officers language. At the same time, too, the department is in the process of being investigated by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the DOJ, investigations which will both likely conclude with consent decrees that will mandate a series of reforms in the department. At the same time, though, there's a ton of pressure on the mayor and city council to increase funding to the Office of Violence Prevention program. Every neighborhood in the city, it seems like, is developing their own violence interruption demonstration projects, increasingly funded by the city. We're right this month starting to roll out a new mental health responder unit that is not a co-responder unit. It's just mental health professionals that will respond to behavioral crises. The city council is also considering alternatives to armed police officers monitoring traffic offenses. And on that, new city council voted in 2021 include a record-breaking majority women and majority people of color, and 3 city council members who ran as DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, endorsed candidates. So while the mayor won his bid for re-election and has largely been against question 2, and unfortunately, sort of the lead on city council who sort of implemented OVP also got voted out, replaced by a more moderate challenger. There's also a lot of energy and enthusiasm on the new city council from the left, which are pushing forward these kind of transformational reforms. So in short, I think the future in Minneapolis is really uncertain and unsettled. And if I've learned anything, it's that it is premature to make conclusions about what things might look like moving forward. I think if you had asked 100 folks who study these issues in 2019 what the likelihood of having a national conversation about abolition in 2020 was, they would not have thought it very likely. And so I think that gives us a sense of humility about predicting the future. And I think all of the people who've been drawn into the summer 2020 conversations and all of the movement around activism in Minneapolis and across the country is going to continue to play out in city, state, and federal governments in really complicated ways, despite this sort of retrenchment narrative and concerns about fear of crime. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about other Minneapolis stuff or kind of broaden it out, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And as you said, there is a lot to unpack. So I also encourage participants to write their questions in the chat box. So we'll have time in the end, and hopefully we'll get to your questions. So thanks, Michelle, very much again. So our next speaker is Ian Loader. Ian is professor of criminology at the University of Oxford and professorial fellow at All Souls College. Among multiple honors, Ian is a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society for the Arts. He's really one of the world's leading criminologists. He's author of the 6 books, including Public Criminology, ? With Richard Sparks, and 6 edited volumes, including the Sage Handbook of Global Policing, published in 2016. Ian has widely published theoretical and empirical papers on policing, private security, public sensibilities towards crime, penal policy and culture, the politics of crime control, and the public roles of criminology. So as for the other speakers, I have a question for you to start the conversation, Ian. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. So can the fund the police framework and discourse travel beyond the US border? So to a certain extent, how can US originated conversations, concepts, notions, and proposals about police reform be translated across the pond and beyond and elsewhere, considering similar problems, but also different national histories, cultures, and government structures and arrangements? Thank you very much again.
Okay, hello, good afternoon, well, depending where you are in the world. It's here, where I am, it's good afternoon. And as I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for that introduction and the question. I guess the starting point for the question, I guess, is the observation that a set of demands that have travelled under the label or umbrella defunding the police do seem to have had effects, and a kind of connection have been mobilised in many other settings across the world, despite their US provenance. And I guess my remarks today are really not an attempt to answer the question of why and how that's happened, but merely an attempt to kind of make some suggestions for how we might make sense of what on the one hand looks like just a kind of evident fact that these ideas have not confined themselves to US borders and do appear to have these kind of global resonances. The starting point, I think, for that more comparative discussion does, though, have to be attending to the ways in which defunding the police is a local American phenomenon, by which I mean a phenomenon that has emerged from and in important senses related both to certain key features of American social structure and to its landscape of crime and policing. So with respect to the former, I think we can point to such things as the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and a continuous history of structural racism, to the close intersections between race and class in the creation of marked forms of urban segregation, in the undeveloped nature of the American welfare state, in comparatively high levels of poverty, drug addiction, child mortality, and the like. With reference to the latter, one might talk to the long-standing inability of the American state to actually claim a monopoly of violence within its territory, to high rates of homicide, both homicide and police killing, to the ubiquity of guns and all that entails for the lethality of violence, to a localized and decentralized policing system, to low levels of police training, powerful and politically active police unions, the legal doctrine of qualified immunity, and so on and so forth. You kind of get the picture, I hope. And I think this is the background in which we, at the very least, need to kind of have in mind when we begin to think about defunding the police and its travels across the globe. Now, as the anthropologist Jan Beek and his colleagues point out in a forthcoming collection of essays called Policing Differences in Europe, they argue that European societies, if we start there, lack these legacies and have their own distinctive configurations of othering. In other words, their own histories of internal and external colonialism, their own patterns of migration, their own histories of repression of marginalized groups, a long history of anti-Semitism, as well as different histories of state formation and distinct political cultures. It's also worth noting, in reference to that book, that Jan Beek and his colleagues are in fact, they're anthropologists of state bureaucracies in Africa. So when one raises the question of the relationship between public police forces and politics and questions of race and identity in the global South, the kind of comparative picture becomes ever more complicated. The conclusion that Beek et al. Draw from that brief comparative tour that they make in the introduction is that it's important in this discussion not to treat the US as some kind of global default situation, as if that's the place we need to turn to understand contemporary policing. I think a further reason for doing that, and in a sense a further a risk of the kind of attention that's been focused on the states, quite properly given the kind of moral and political urgency of the circumstance and situation, is there is a risk at the moment in terms of the kind of global policing community of disproportionately focusing on the USA as our site of attention, which I think would be unfortunate given that it already features disproportionately in both cultural representations and knowledge production in respect of police. So I think one starting point for the kind of does defunding travel question has to be that acknowledgement of the US-centered nature of the defunding movement and the differences with in other places in which it has resonated. Now, that having been said, it is, however, I think possible to identify a whole set of family resemblances or structural homologies across modern capitalist democracies in terms of how we might think about the relationship between policing and the social. So let me just mention two. In structurally divided societies, as Otwin Marinen pointed out nearly 40 years ago now, the police do two things. Firstly, they kind of manage, they importantly don't produce, but they manage a general sense of order from which everyone benefits to at least a certain extent. And secondly, they sustain a specific social structure that benefits some groups over others. Policing, in other words, is inescapably a mix of protection and control. And the lower down the hierarchies of race and class one gets, the more the balance between protection and control shifts towards the latter. I think something like that is true, both historically and across many contemporary jurisdictions. Secondly, it seems to me that we need help. We can helpfully think about the ways in which policing sociologically is a kind of institution of social sorting and boundary maintenance. One of its, in a sense, its social functions is to patrol social borders, to mediate in important ways the boundaries of membership and belonging. So in societies marked by patterns of racial exploitation and division, police talk and action is powerfully implicated both in the making of remaking of racial categories and indeed of the making of and sustaining of race as a category. How this is done in particular settings always warrants our close attention, both at both macro and micro levels. But across various settings, I think it's important to both say and to bear in mind that the police are powerful agents of what Fields in an American context call racecraft. Now, it's with these considerations in mind that I think we can approach this question of does or can or how defunding the police has travelled. Now, one way of addressing that question is to I guess, to think about work in the tradition of of policy transfer. There's been a whole bunch of work in recent years on that in criminology, or on the circulation of criminal ideas, and pay close attention to the practices, the motivations, the kind of power and influence, the networks of various kinds of exporters of ideas, to focus on the facilitation provided by various kinds of importers of ideas, and to think about how a bunch of ideas that might travel under this notion of defunding have been received or contested or refused or adapted in different local contexts. I have a hunch that there are many projects on Black Lives Matter and on defunding the police that could be conducted along these lines. It may simply be my ignorance not to know about projects that are being conducted on these lines, but in the absence of them, or of my knowledge of them, I don't want to pursue that line of inquiry in the minutes remaining to me today. An alternative way, it seems to me, to think about the kind of travelling question has been to pay attention to the ways in which Black Lives Matter and the defunding the police movement has provided a set of kind of actions, programs, demands that have resonated across borders among theorists, among activists in policy communities, well beyond a US context, and have provided both a set of things to think about and a set of tools to think with, and have had the effect, at least this is my kind of hunch that I think is worth exploring, had the effect of opening up space for new conversations and new contestations, for rendering certain kinds of things publicly sayable in a way that wasn't previously the case in relative recent years, and has to some extent shifted the dial in terms of kind of both public discourse and campaigning and certain kinds of policy formations around policing questions. Now, of course, that's a kind of hunch or a claim, and that too requires some serious attention. That too requires some focusing on the different kinds of translation that are involved in how people use those tools, or the way in which they're deployed in particular contexts and particular things that have become now publicly sayable. But I want to conclude really by just saying a few words about defunding the police, in a sense, from that standpoint. Now, the initial thing to say here is, I think, that it's worth paying attention here when we think about defunding to what I at least take to be, or have tried in some of the things I've written about this, try to understand as an expansive and overlapping set of demands that are mobilized under the umbrella of defunding, that kind of refuse that kind of literalized meaning that have enabled a whole series of political actors on the centre left to dismiss defunding as some kind of infantile slogan. I'm thinking of the kind of casual remarks of people, Joe Biden, of Tony Blair, of Keir Starmer, all of whom have kind of made utterances along those lines. And I think operating with a more expansive sense of what defunding has come to mean is kind of helpful, not only politically, but helpful in actually coming to a kind of fuller comparative understanding of what is going on when various kind of ideas travel outside of American context. So I think the first thing that's, and I'll just mention a couple of these and focus on the latter ones. The first kind of thing that has been, I think, going on under the broad a defunding umbrella is what you might call a kind of radical liberal refusal of state power, or fear of state power, and a kind of renewed attention on what in a sense is a very old question to do with the importance of actively and constantly monitoring police and police activity. You know, think of the activities carried out by D. Roy McKesson and I forgot the name, under the 8 Can't Wait. Think of some of the work that's done under the practices of cop watching. And what's going on here is, I think, an important reminder of both the importance of that kind of monitoring, and of the significance and difficulties of trying to constrain police power and subject it to some kind of legal or social regulation. Secondly, I think there's an important strand of work that kind of needs to be folded under the defunding umbrella, which has to do with trying to think through in a policing context a whole series of ideas concerned with radical democracy or forms of neighbourhood participatory governance. And we've seen here both a kind of, I think, a very important critique of the practices and limits of certain civilian policing boards in the States and elsewhere, which are kind of limited to consultation and focused on trying to secure input from citizens of various kinds, towards trying to get us to think harder and to encourage experiments in effectively forms of neighbourhood control. In the US, black neighbourhood control over police forces, where decisions about hiring, about priorities, about budgets are actually taken out of the hands of the police and placed in the hands of some kind of new form of neighbourhood body. And this brings us thirdly to the ideas that both Jennifer and Michelle have already been discussing in an American context. And I think that they have to do with a set of things which I think are about the attempts to kind of de-center the police from the kind of public imagination with respect to questions of crime and harm, and as it were, radically socialized public safety. So some of this is about divestment, reducing the size and scale and footprint of the police in the ways that have just been alluded to. Some of this, as Jennifer and Michelle have talked about, has to do with a kind of reinvestment of that divested money in other kinds of social services in ways that I think has drawn important attention for those of us who work and think about in other places, both to the ways in which the police can either actively or sometimes inadvertently colonize other areas of public policy, which are probably best dealt with under the headings of education or mental health and like. And draw attention to the importance of trying to reallocate some of those responsibilities where they properly fall. And I think in that context, there are some significant differences that we need to attend to. I think one of the things that's become clear in the American context is that calling the police in situations where there are clearly questions of mental health at stake, or calling the police to do a well-being check, can just have potentially lethal consequences in ways it can have in other contexts, but much less often does. I think it also draws our attention to some of the similarities in these cases, which, as Jennifer and Michelle were pointing out, has something to do with the ways in which social problems, once the police are involved, get reframed under a kind of crime or order or disorder label, rather than as problems of mental health or of poverty or of addiction or of so forth, but also involve at some point a kind of hard dilemma, which is for all you might want to resist that kind of framing of those problems in that way, there is still a question. It goes, and in a sense, it's Egan Bittner's old question about what do you do in those situations in social life where force is temporarily and situationally required to provisionally repair a broken social situation. And I suppose for the moment, I just want to leave that question hanging in the air. And I think the third thing to say, and this is why I think this is one of the ways in which, when I made that point about defunding the police, kind of shifting the dial and making possible certain kinds of conversations, I think the invitation to all of us outside the states to kind of think about this question from an abolitionist horizon has been an important move. And it's not been an important move because anyone thinks or is trying to pretend that somehow the police can just be abolished in any short order of time. But I think it's been an important move because it's helped to shake. It's helped to shake and unsettle a certain kind of police fetishism. In other words, the idea that somehow there's a kind of inevitability about state policing and an obvious common sense association between crime and harm on the one hand and police on the other. So I think this is both involved, as in the ways that Jennifer described, both a whole series of experiments in how you might do harm prevention and conflict intervention differently, but importantly done in a spirit which has tried to disentangle questions about public safety and its meanings in practices from a more limited discussion about policing and what the more limited, if necessary, tasks of policing may turn out to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ian. It was such an interesting presentation, and I think that we are really bridging the conversations and the themes that have been presented so far by you, Jennifer, and Michelle. So I see there's a question from Professor Kieran McAvoy. We will have the questions after our final presentation. And Ian's presentation is really a great segue to get to the presentation by Dr. John Topping. John is a senior lecturer in criminology in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work here at Queen's. His research focuses in the area of policing, is widely published, but he's also been involved in a series of research consultancy and advisory roles with all of the major policing institutions across Northern Ireland. And he has also acted as an independent member of the Belfast Policing and Community Safety Partnership. So before I give the floor to you, John, I remember that when we were talking about this event, what came to mind was an article published in the Washington Post in early June of 2020, titled, "What the US Can Learn from the History of Northern Ireland. More policing is not the answer to our unrest." So I think it's great to focus on the experience of Northern Ireland, on the experience of radical police reform in the late 1990s, and the subsequent transformation regarding composition, culture, and relationship with the community on the side of the police. What can the Northern Ireland experience teach reform movements in the US and elsewhere? Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Alessandro. Great to see, virtually anyway, everybody in a gloomy Belfast afternoon, a nice global audience, and of course, all the esteemed speakers who've come before me and made my job as the last act much more difficult than I had imagined an hour ago. But anyway, I suppose in answering your question and hopefully to contribute today, I'm actually really delighted to have to say, I think following the demise with what was once I suppose you might call a criminologically fashionable trend for the study of police reform in Northern Ireland, I think we're again returning to lessons in policing here. I mean, perhaps outside some of the technical lessons, but I think to wider comparisons of what police reform means for communities and sections of society who have been over-policed and under-protected, for communities who continue to lack trust in or see the police as legitimate because of historical relations, and I think, you know, set against some of those wider issues stemming from before and after George Floyd murder, and of course today the defund type momentum that we're seeing globally. And when I was asked to talk in the panel, I think the first thing which came to my head was, what on earth was I going to say new about police reform in Northern Ireland that hasn't already been said? And I think stemming from that as well, you know, how little of the lived reality and context about policing and community relations I actually know about in the US to draw useful comparison as somebody who's been always focused on this side of the Atlantic. But I think having worked and researched in policing here for over 15 years now, along with an equal number of years in the voluntary and community or third sector I'll talk about, I think there are definitely many useful and insightful and lived experiences to be had here. And I think hopefully it'll contribute to the debate today and round it off. So really what I want to do over the next 10 minutes or so, I don't want to get bogged down in historical detail of police reform or structures. But what I want to do is raise a few broader observations, which perhaps with a pinch of criminological hindsight might provide some thoughts about going forward on all these issues. And I suppose the first question, what about policing change then in Northern Ireland? I think, as I said, without getting into history, of course, the agreed police reform process here, crafted under the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which created and turned the Independent Commission on Policing for Northern Ireland, otherwise known as the Patton Report for our international audience, chaired by the former governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patton. And that international panel produced its 175 recommendations for change in September 1999, and that stemmed from, amongst others, the views of around 10,000 people at public meetings, and another sort of 2,500 individual and group written submissions. It's been well rehearsed elsewhere and over the years, but certainly the police reform process here has been described as one of the most complex, largest and well-funded experiments ever attempted in Western policing. And again, across another, outside those 175 recommendations for change, across another 772 performance indicators from the 19 Oversight Commissioner reports headed up by Al Hutchison at the time, and about another 1,000 or so recommendations stemming from those, according to PSNI. I think the scale and complexity of changing the former Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, into the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI, can be seen, and one which I suppose you have to remember happened within a relatively short period of time when PSNI came into existence in November 2001. But I think crucially, beyond some of this superficial context, it was actually David Bailey, who sadly passed away recently, the policing scholar, who said that in essence, he was very involved here. The police reform process in Northern Ireland was essentially about wrestling 30 years of state monopoly in policing from the police and giving it back to the people. So in 2022, where has all that gotten us, and what have we learned in the 20 years of that continual and ongoing change process? And I think the first thing for me, and probably central to my points today, is going back to one of the Patton commissioners. Many of you will be familiar with his work, Clifford Shearing. And he noted that rather than see the 175 recommendations for change, I would encourage you to have a read at it, rather than see those as one big block, it was actually better to see the reform process here in two particular streams. The first stream focused around the systems of policing, as you might call it. I suppose chimes with some of the defund debates we're talking about today, such as names, badges, recruitment and representation, training and human rights. And the second stream then was focused around something, again, will be much more familiar. Second stream is really focused around the governance of security, or in Clifford's words, policing more broadly conceived. And why am I mentioning this? Because I think crucially, one of the big learning points for me and for today is that we did see a very significant and I think still to this day, an over concentration on the first stream of reform here, the systems, at the expense of our second stream around the governance of security. So from 2001 through to about 2010-11, I mean, the policing budget in Northern Ireland, remember this is for a population of that about 1.7 million people. The budget in 2001 went from 650 million to 1.2 billion for the policing, for the overall policing system here. And just as a metric of the focus on the systems, and I think in view of the wider policing oversight and monitoring structures in place and all the legal frameworks governing that, absolutely everything police reform in Northern Ireland came to be about the police organisation itself, to the exclusion of wider thinking on policing. And police-centric performance and oversight metrics then became the defining measure of success of policing being seen to work and, importantly, change. But, as we know, related to policing across the globe, and particularly, I think, the defund debates, simply more police officers, shiny new badges, better training, or what might be seen, at least Northern Ireland, as a global gold standard of oversight and reform processes, that is no guarantee of success for communities disaffected by policing. And again, the success of research has shown over the years, from myself, from many other colleagues here at Queen's and beyond, having the best policing system, whatever that is, can still never fix, as we've talked about today, the social, economic and social justice issues underpinning the lived realities. And I think that's the key, the lived realities of communities most affected by the conflict here in the past, and still to this day in the present, who bear the brunt of the majority of policing attention. Because I think we must remember that old adage, I think we often forget it, policing works best where it's needed least. And I think there's always been an assumption that this new, I'm supposed to steal Sia Zedner's terminology, this solid state policing apparatus, the police reform process in Northern Ireland, that somehow that could just be layered on to society and that would be the job done. And again, there's an apathy around that, which is a point to pick up. And again, even back in 2000, I think it was 7-8, David Bailey, I remember very well, he came over to do a seminar in Belfast about the police reform, and he said even at the time the sentiment in the United States about Northern Ireland, and this is to quote unquote, it basically said, have you fuckers not fixed yourselves yet? I always remember him saying that, and that was the sentiment about, we just thought it was job done. And I think, in 2022, I think because of, the complex amalgam of history, sectarian politics, unresolved legacy issues here, and of course, we do have an ongoing severe terrorist threat, it remains, a very difficult environment in which to deliver normalised forms of policing, particularly for those affected communities from the conflict. And I think these very issues, and this sort of futurology, I know Michelle picked up on, these very issues were not what the police reform process, which started back in 1999, envisaged would still be in play in 2022. So what we're saying here is the police reform, that the technical, practical reforms have moved at a very different speed to societal change as well. So what I'm saying, really, in over 20 years, trust, legitimacy, recruitment to the police and ability to deliver normal policing to those communities most affected by the conflict remains a significant challenge in spite of the reform process. Perhaps, again, a lesson for other jurisdictions, particularly states, thinking about this. So I think while on one hand, police reform here, there is optimism in terms of what has been achieved. I think on the other hand, some caution that police-only solutions can only ever get us so far, as important as they are, but they are a start. Although I think, as we know too, even with the most stringent oversight and accountability systems as we have here, there is no guarantee that bad policing habits will disappear either. We only have to look at the very high levels of stop and search by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, by its own metrics, the worst performer in the UK, bar the Metropolitan Police. At the lack of diversity and community representation still in PSNI ranks, for example, the infringement of journalistic human rights investigating the conflict, and even accusations of institutional racism due to the manner in which the PSNI policed the Black Lives Matter protest in Belfast in 2020. So I think what I'm saying here is that while the front of house policing, as you might have called it, has been changed within PSNI, what you might term some of those deeper state policing issues still continue to exert influence and exist in the background. But I do want to return to Clifford Shearing and to that second stream of policing, because I think while I'm arguing here, there was an overemphasis on our first stream of reforms. There was a very deliberate shunning at the time of wider thinking around policing. And I think, everybody in this call, or most of you in this call, I think, will probably be to some extent aware of the long histories of so-called paramilitary policing in the country as a sort of extrajudicial social control and violence, black criminal justice, whatever, many different terms, that did and still happens to this day, as human rights abuses directed mostly at young males being shot, beaten and excluded from life. But what I am saying for today is that in fact is not the only side of the non-state, cheers Alessandro, of the non-state policing picture, because I think what the Patent Commissioners did in fact see was and understand that Northern Ireland was alive and still is with a vibrant, legitimate, hyper-organised civil society sector with many self-help groups and agencies and of varying levels of sophistication, both before and to this day. They have been shoring up deficits in state-based policing provision. So I think it was curious that the only recommendation out of the 175, patent recommendation 32, which proposed local tax raising powers for policing in the widest sense, was the only one ever to make it into legislation. So really a big lesson here as part of the defund movements is, I think, to look here, and Northern Ireland has a long, I think, if under-researched pedigree, long pedigree in legitimate community-based security governance and policing outside state-based delivery. It's been happening for over 40 years, and perhaps I don't think there are too many have really studied it. Maybe one of the few people, this form of shadow policing, and it spans you know, everything from education, intervention, youth work, interface violence, restorative justice, community safety work, for example. And I remember just before the pandemic hit, it was actually Judge Alex Kilbreezy from the Red Hook Community Court in Brooklyn. He came over for a visit to a community-based restorative justice organisation, which I am chairperson of, so I'm going to mention him, Community Restorative Justice Ireland, and he was blown away by the social capital and community activism here. So why am I mentioning this, and just getting towards the end here, because it's absolutely pertinent to the idea, and this sort of defund, is to look beyond the police as part of change and to look to community. And for any reform to be effective, it must speak community language. It must you know, involve not just individuals in the community, but representative groups and organisations in decision making and planning and intervention and oversight, because they are the ones best placed to understand deprivation, social problems, and local solutions to local problems. Because I think, as we've understood for a long time here, you can't shoot deprivation, you can't shoot educational underachievement, you can't shoot social policy. It's the quality of life and living conditions which actually make the difference. So, I mean, just to finish, if anything, only I think by broadening our language around policing change and not narrowing the scope of what defines and who should be involved in the business of policing, that's a key lesson from here, I would say today, which was never really learned from the police reform process in Northern Ireland, because it's in those communities where to this day policing is contested, not accepted, or still not even seen as legitimate for a whole host of reasons, where such activism has been and is at the forefront of community safety and this sort of shadow policing, as I've called it. Because I think last thing I'll say, below lazy stereotypes of communities who don't trust the police as some kind of you know, right of centre political code for criminality and lawlessness, I think, as the evidence shows us here, communities do want security, communities do want justice, they want policing and they want safety, but just not in the over-police and under protected police-centric manner, which as a bad policing habit globally, so it seems even that has evaded here, even the best attempts at police reform and change. So a few lessons there, Alessandro, and I will pause at that as a few snippets of what we might have learned from policing in Northern Ireland.
So thank you very, very much, John. We are so surprisingly running on time, which is unusual for this kind of events. We really wanted to have as many relevant voices as possible. So Kieran, if you still have your question, I upgraded you to a presenter. So we have some time, say 10 to 15 minutes, questions from the audience, or if then speakers, they want to respond to each other. Of course, I would have some follow-up questions, but please, Kieran, the floor is yours. Kieran McAvoy, Professor of Law and Transitional Justice here at Queen's.
Sure, thanks, Alessandro, and thanks to the speakers. I actually put the question in the chat bar, but Michelle, I'll ask you now directly. So you'll see in the chat bar there, basically myself and others, as John was hinting at, were in the late 1990s, very influenced by Clifford Shearing. And we were making an argument. Basically, we were at the moment where in some ways you guys are a critical juncture where you think you have maybe the capacity to tilt the axis a little bit in terms of, you know, we were rethinking what policing meant in this jurisdiction. And one of the arguments that we were pressing hard at the time, influenced by Clifford, was okay, perhaps we could come up with a situation where everybody accepts the police are not the right response to every problem. And therefore, could we come up with a way in which, for example, community organizations involved in restorative justice or drug work or youth work or crime prevention could bid against the cops for, you know, this is a piece of work that we should be doing rather than you guys, rather than the assumption that the policing budget goes straight to the cops. We failed to persuade the mainstream political parties that was anything else other than a radical pipe dream. So my question to you, Michelle, is there a way in which defunding can be framed that could get, for example, Democratic Party buy-in?
Thank you for the question, and I really appreciate Ian Ian comments before. I think sometimes in the U.S. we think about the Europe kind of uncritically as like the place where if we had a functioning welfare state and didn't have the kinds of legacies of slavery that we have in the United States, that we would have a more functional criminal justice system. I think sometimes Europe sort of stands in, particularly Scandinavian countries, stand in the US for sort of what reform might look like if it worked. And I'm always really encouraged when I see work that takes seriously that policing is policing wherever you are, right? There are these democratic tensions because it is inherent to the institution and isn't something you can just reform your way out of. And similarly with prisons. And so it's exciting to be in that conversation. To answer this question more directly, I mean, I think certainly on the edges, this is already happening, right? So if you look at, some of the budget proposals from the Biden administration, right, funding for these kinds of violence interruption programs is massively expanding, but it's massively expanding because it started out teeny tiny, right? Like if we think about in Minneapolis, like the OVP budget now is on the order of magnitude of like 10 million, which is a massive increase because it started at 1 million, but it's still teeny tiny compared to the MPD budget of about 190 million. So I think the way to do it from a political standpoint is to talk about it not as an alternative to I think, well, let me say, if your goal is to get mainstream Democrats on board, which may or may not be your goal, I think the way to do it then is to talk about it not as an alternative to police, but a way to sort of address these problems so that policing can be more effective, right? It was framed in Minneapolis as a both and approach. But I think what that then touches on is like, well, where does the money actually come from? And will this actually address police violence? Because can it ever actually be scaled up without substantial investments? And I think one of the challenges in the United States, and this comes back to Ian's comments about the uniqueness of the kind of decentralization of things in the United States, is I think even if we took all of the money from police budgets, it still wouldn't be enough to create really comprehensive solutions. Like you can't back end a welfare state by just taking that money out of policing departments. Like in Minneapolis, it's like 9% of the city budgets. We spend almost as much on our parks as we do on our police. Granted, we're kind of crazy about our parks, but like our education budget just for local education is way bigger, but it's way bigger because it's funded by state funds, not local funds, right? And so without really like state and federal systems of economic redistribution, you're just never going to have the funds to get any of this stuff up to scale to make kind of the larger impacts that you're looking for.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We have the next question from Professor Graham Hillison, who's a professor of criminology in the School of Law here at Queen's. So Graham, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alessandro. Very good papers, everyone. So, and I think in the interest of fairness, I've got questions for everyone. So shall I just read them out and then you can come to them? So Jennifer and Michelle, I've given you one between you. So, right, so my question is, to what extent are police responses to incidents involving African Americans conditioned by a belief that they, i.e. the police, are likely to be more at risk of violence, including lethal gun violence? So if this is a cop culturalist perception, you're based on beliefs within the police culture itself, what can be done to mitigate it on the part of the police? Shall I just read out everyone's question then, or do you want to answer them as we go along? Alessandro, what do you want me to do?
So we can start having the first one
right.
answered. So Jennifer, you want to go ahead? Thank you.
Yeah, there is quite a bit of literature that shows that police officers and departments will generally focus a lot of their attention, certainly in high crime neighborhoods where there's a disproportionate number of Black and brown people. And unfortunately, there is quite a bit of literature that shows the view that African-American individuals, particularly young Black men, are stereotyped as being criminals, being aggressive, being dangerous. And so as a result, they are policed certainly much more aggressively in nature. And even those who reside in these neighborhoods, they may be high crime neighborhoods, but they can't move from one neighborhood to another. This is what they can afford, and yet they're still being treated very suspiciously and as if they're criminals when they're not doing anything wrong. So I think part of the issue is that certainly this the stereotypes, which we know is dates all the way back to slavery, that again, Black people are considered inferior, considered more dangerous and criminal. In terms of what can be done, you know, in the past, I would have said more police training, right? But when you look at the literature, you know, police departments, many police departments have received, again, training as it relates to diversity training, de-escalation training, implicit bias training, you know, with the hopes that it would actually reduce or change police behavior. But the literature is not showing that. So for me, in terms of what can be done, the reason why I spoke so much about defund the police is because I think this is potentially a valid way to kind of move forward. And it's really about addressing the root cause of violence. And again, as I mentioned in my presentation, Cahoots in Oregon is doing this. I didn't mention before, but there's also an innovative approach called Cure Violence, which is another organization that attempts to stop the spread of violence by using various methods and strategies associated with disease control. So that is, it includes, they're trying to detect and interrupt conflict, as well as identify and treat the highest risk individuals through trained, credible messengers. Cure Violence operates independently of law enforcement, and they, again, rely on violence interrupters, those who've even had their own experience with crime and violence, to try to stop violent incidences through direct intervention. They also rely on outreach workers, and Cure Violence has shown success in reducing urban gun violence, as well as declining support for violence as a means for settling personal disputes. So I would say, like, when we have programs like Cure Violence, Advanced Peace, Cahoots, certainly much more evaluation studies need to be done to determine its effectiveness, and it needs to be done. And if one proven effective, really trying to broaden this out in different places to see how effective is it, and does it continue to be, to reduce not only crime, but also increase people's ability to secure various services.
Michelle, do you also want to speak to that question? And then we can move to Graham's next question, I guess, for Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really brief because I want others to have a chance to speak up. But I guess I would say, you know, on the reconciliation piece and the sort of apologizing for past harms, you know, that was really key to the national initiatives. And it's funny because every time in the chat somebody says NI, I think national initiatives, not Northern Ireland. But you know, the national initiatives in the US, which Minneapolis was one of the pilot studies, that was one of their key pillars, was police need to kind of reckon with this racialized history of policing. And I think police departments have had a lot of trouble doing that piece. That was definitely part of the NI that failed the most profoundly, was this community engagement piece. And I think part of it was a lot easier for department leadership to think about sort of like the civil rights era and think about sort of historical damages, and much harder for them to think about contemporary issues, in part because so many of the people killed by police were then found to have followed all department policies and protocols. And so police are very hesitant to apologize in these cases where somebody was, for instance, armed, or there was some perception of some threat to officers or others. And so their language about talking about this stuff, it gets really difficult for them to take this structural approach where they see sort of the damage of policing as an institution without being really defensive about acknowledging that, you know, the assumption being that individual officers have committed criminal offenses, because that's what the kind of push has been from activists, is at least early on, was to criminalize the individual officers. And so departments are very defensive. And so I agree wholly with Jennifer that I think, defund gives us a route out of that, right? If you can sort of acknowledge publicly that policing inherently involves this threat of state violence alongside the promise of state protection, and that the answer then is to remove the threat of state violence where we can, I think that acknowledges that harm in a much more direct way than these sort of statements that are meant to kind of convey this history, but often fail to either be said or to connect with community members.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So, Graham, could you please ask the question for Ian, and then we have Chloe Carragher, who I think has a question for John. So,
yeah, that's fine. No, I'd written these down, so I'm just going to read it out. So, Ian, this is yours. So, is there a sense that the situation in English or UK cities involving minority ethnic relationships with the police is not as bad, inverted commas, as seems to be the case in the United States? Would that be a correct reading of the situation, and if so, why?
Ian, you're still muted. If you can unmute yourself, thank you so much.
2 years on, we never learn. I think I'm hesitating to kind of couch my answer to this question in terms of kind of bad or better or worse. It's different, and there are certain kinds of analogs and there are certain kinds of differences. The one obvious difference is just the ubiquity of guns in the American situation, but I mean, I think it just changes the dynamic very, very, very radically. Most obviously in the kind of risk and actuality of lethal violence, kind of shaping the relationship between police and minority groups. So if I was to use the word better at all in answer to your question, one of the only ways in which I'd emphatically think about the situation in England and Wales as better is in that regard. But in many ways, I think that, and this goes to the point I was trying to make about the kind of structural homologies, that in terms of the kind of patterns and the kinds of issues that occur, in terms of the inability ever to kind of seemingly the kind of endless cycle of kind of reform talk and the persistence of the same kinds of problems. I mean, I think about just what has and hadn't happened since the Macpherson report 20 years ago, which was supposed to be a kind of watershed moment in the history of police relations with minority groups in this country. Some things have changed, but in terms of the kind of broad dynamics of the problem, in all kinds of ways, it hasn't. So I think it would. I'm not saying this was the assumption behind your question. I think it's a great mistake. I mean, this is kind of contrary to what Michelle was just trying to say. It's a great mistake for anyone who's involved in doing or thinking about policing in England to look at the situation in the States and just kind of complacently say, oh, kind of that's nothing to do with us. Because I think there is a way in which the same kinds of issues are shoot through and have shot through for many, many years the dynamics of English policing without any obvious radical change or resolution. So it seems like a woolly answer, but that's the best I can come up with for now.
Thank you so much, Ian. Chloe, do you want to jump in to ask your question? Again, short questions, short answers, because I would like to get to 3 more questions before the end of this absolutely fascinating and interesting discussion. So, Chloe, I made you a presenter, so you can, if you want, turn your camera and/or microphone on.
I think she's saying she can't, Alessandra. She's in the library.
Okay. So, Chloe's question is, building on what Professor Topping touched on, 2 decades of from the disbandment of the RUC, the damages associated with their time in command continue to remain critical to community police relations in Northern Ireland. What can the BLM movement learn from such legacy issues, and how can we as academics ensure such lessons can be made accessible to the general public? So, great question.
I would just quickly say, I think it is important to develop strategies and promote, in terms of promoting the slogan. And there's still misinterpretation about what defund the police means, and even, Black Lives Matters. And so I do think it's important to promote these slogans and messages for different audiences. There is certainly a sense of fear in the populace around defunding the police. And so I would say, the Black Lives Matter movement can certainly partner with communication brands and advertising agencies to develop marketing strategies for maximum outreach of their goals.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe the Black Lives Matter movement and the historical policing and all the problems that we've had here necessarily directly comparable. What I would say, I think for any groups which are disaffected, disenfranchised, over-policed, underprotected by the police organization, things move very, very slowly. It takes an awful long time and an awful lot of money to restructure the police. That precludes the actual restructuring and change to police culture, and that in itself moves at a different speed to the building and rebuilding and maintaining relations with those communities set against the background which underpin these fractured relations themselves. I remember, again, I've drawn quite a lot on David Bailey today. I was reading back through some of his materials from his time here, and he said, there are two ways to look at the reform process here. One, you can be really optimistic about all that has been achieved and where we've gotten, and so on and so forth, and certainly lots of positives. But he said there's also a very sort of heavy thread of pessimism to what happened here, because if it took the financial and political capital and influence from America and the Good Friday Agreement and internationally recognized peace treaties registered with the UN to make this change, took that to make this change for 1.7 million people, there's maybe not an awful lot of hope for other democracies out there unless they are prepared to put in that sheer level of effort. So it was a colossal amount of effort, and as I've already said, sort of my paper, there's some things, the bad habits still haven't changed. That sort of global thread. And just maybe to pick up briefly, then, how can these issues be made to the public? Again, another lesson: you can do all the reform you want, but we didn't. One thing which we absolutely didn't do in Northern Ireland was educate the public about what the police are and what we should expect from them. And I think that's very much a learning curve we're still on. And the fact that for a population of 1.8 million, I think last year PSNI received somewhere in the region of nearly 1 million calls for service in some shape or form. We're just colossally dependent on the police, and I think the only way to change that is to, as everybody else has talked about, begin to change the dynamic there, the reliance on the police, the cultural, the political reliance that everything that goes wrong in society is a police issue, and start to shift our gaze. And I think academics, we're one small part of that puzzle, and in terms of outreach and setting out the edges to that. So that's all. Hopefully that answers the question somewhat, Chloe.
So we have 3 more questions. Michelle, please go ahead.
Could I hop in just to offer a counter perspective on this, just to broaden us out a bit? Not that I disagree with any of that. I guess my concern is a little bit like when we start to talk about, we need to do more sort of PR campaigns or work with media groups. I mean, I think sometimes, especially around sort of education about what police do and are responsible for, which is one of the things Minneapolis is considering, is we developed another like a 311 line instead of 911 line, and they're going to roll out like a public education campaign, and they're now talking about having a special number just for mental health calls that go to different dispatchers. So I get the kind of public campaign around sort of like specific policy reforms, but I think sometimes the fear of those is that they'll essentially be used for police department PR and a way for police departments to justify and legitimate themselves and sort of pacify the public by presenting kind of the officer point of view. And there's been some great recent work done on like how police departments use social media to kind of like frame the discourses after these critical incidents. And so I worry a little bit that some of these kind of, the whole point of as Ian said, right, what's great about sort of abolition entering the conversation and the way it did in 2020 is that it really expands our horizons and challenges the hegemonic ideas about policing. But one of the things that I think an abolitionist lens tells us is any kind of messaging that attempts to increase trust between communities and police is also simultaneously counter-revolutionary, right? And for me, I think that really pushes me to think about, like, what is the public education we're trying to do? And a lot of the abolitionist activists I talked to very explicitly saw their role as kind of changing public discourses, right? And changing public discourses sort of one-to-one, person-to-person, to kind of evade some of these limits of sort of state-based strategies or sort of more kind of mainstream media strategies. So I don't know. I myself, I think it depends what day and what time you ask me how I think about some of these issues.
Okay, I would say two final questions, 2/3. So from Teresa Dagenhardt, is there a gender dimension to the defund the police debate in the States? And I think this is a great question because, at least as far as I know, this has not been an issue at the forefront of the debate, but I would really love to hear, and we all would love to hear more from Jennifer and Michelle. Then from Alili Albert, and this is a great point. So rising crime rates, Michelle already partially addressed that point. Rising crime rates during the pandemic, and we see law enforcement narratives taking back control. So what do you think is going to happen in the midterm, long term? So how is this shifting narrative trying to seize back momentum in terms of, again, revolution, counter-revolution, and things that will be done? Final question from me. So I think that what Ian said about traveling, not just of policies, but also of opening up more space for public conversations and public contestation. I think this is an absolutely great point. But if we had a tag cloud out of this conversation, I think that community engagement and budget would be two of the words. So how do you get community on board with the idea of radical reforms if they think that defund the police in these constant austerity times means that the budget is not going to be diverted, it's just going to disappear? So how do we have to change the message? And I think that Jennifer really pointed that out at the beginning. So we're talking about defunding and diverting to a certain extent, like making more apparent that we are reinvesting these resources subtracted to traditional police funding to fund other more fruitful and productive initiatives at the community level. So the gender debate to the defund the police, the rising crime rates, and the diverting budget question. So I think that there's something for everyone. So who wants to go first on gender?
Well, I mean, first, I'll touch on the rising crime rate. Certainly, there's concern. Crime rates are going up. There's, we know we're hearing and seeing a lot of gun violence, particularly amid the pandemic. So I do think it will impact the defund the movement in terms of its ability to get momentum. At the same time, I do want to say that defunding the police has not happened in many places, right? Like we've not seen, there's been a lot of talk about defund the police, but the reality is, with the exception of a few cities like New York and Los Angeles and Austin, Texas, where that have seen substantial reductions to general fund police spending, most cities have actually increased funding in police departments, right? Like, so people may be thinking defunding is happening. It's not happening, number one. And so, and number two, defund the police will always fail if the only focus is on reducing the budget for the police department. There has to be a reinvestment in the community. Otherwise, it will fail miserably. All right, it's not just divest. It's divest in police departments and invest in the community. If the latter doesn't happen, it will not work. Crime rates will go up. People will still not get access to various services. Poverty rates will remain high. There'll be joblessness taking place. Like, it's not going to be effective. So there are a couple of things that need to happen in order for this to effectively play out. And so even though crime rates have been we've been seeing a lot of crime take place amid the pandemic, the reality is defunding has not happened in many cities. So I think that's important to capture. I guess I'll say in terms of the gender debate, I think that's a great question. Given the history of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was organized and founded by 3 Black women, and the increasing focus on intersectionality within the Black Lives Matter movement certainly has drawn a lot more women to protest, at least more than in times past. And in the last few decades, women, especially minority groups, are increasingly becoming more politically active worldwide. But it's hard for me to actually say if there's actually like a difference across gender regarding defund the police, except like what I can really speak to is that we're seeing an intersectionality with people who are involved in the movements across, race, gender, age, all that. But I'm not able to speak in terms of whether or not there's a difference across gender as it relates to the debate for defund the police. Michelle, you might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, not directly, but kind of indirectly through conjecture. So I did a bunch of these interviews with North Minneapolis residents in 2017 to 2019. And there was very much a sort of intersectional story. And so I'm really glad you raised the question, Teresa. As Jennifer says, right, this idea of sort of intersectionality in racial justice movements was really critical to Black Lives Matter. And yet, even as so many of the organizers with Black Lives Matter in the beginning, the founders of the hashtag, the global network organizers, many of them were women and non-binary folks. Even in that context, right, most of the cases that were spotlighted through BLM activism were of male victims. And, there's a reason for that demographically, right? Black men are at statistically the greatest rate of being killed by police, but Black women also face much higher rates of police abuse, all the way, from verbal harassment all the way to lethal violence, if you compare them not to Black men, but you compare them to white women, right? And so this intersectional story, I think, is played out in the BLM movement in lots of different ways that have mattered. But the way that it mattered in our interviews was that Black women in particular were the group that were most likely to express this ambivalent tension between wanting state protection and fearing state violence. And they often feared the kind of protection they wanted was often about gender-based violence, right? They were concerned about intimate partner violence, not so much from police officers, but from loved ones in their life. And yet they were terrified to invoke the police to resolve that lack of protection, because they were worried that police were going to kill these men in their lives that they loved, right? Either their partners or their sons or other men in their lives. And so Black women were, I think, the group that were the most ambivalent in our interviews because of this unique positionality, right, of both race and gender oppression. And then if you looked at the white folks that we talked to, white women were much more supportive of these kind of radical reform ideas than white men. They were sort of much more likely to talk about having been moved by the BLM movement, more likely to be, have participated in protests, right, and have talked to other people and have organized around it. And so for them too, I think there was kind of a gender impact there. But if you look at the breakdowns of sort of like who supported the charter amendment in Minneapolis, gender is actually not a huge predictor. It's age that really matters. Even more than race, it's generational changes. The cohort of people who came of age and entered adulthood in the BLM era, I think, is thinking about all of these issues really different from the generations above them. So I'll just pause there.
Ian, please, final word for you. So please.
I wasn't making a pitch for the final word, but I want to pick up on that and your kind of final question, Alessandra. And I think the point I want to make, it's kind of partly a question about language, but it's also a question about where people's energies go. And it has to do with the kind of the words defunding and the word abolition. So the signals so without further exploration in the kind of things that are meant by those terms and the kind of work that people do under those labels, the signals they send have to do with the things that are being critiqued and taken away, not to do with the things people are trying to build in their stead. And if you read the work of Marion Kaber or Ruth Gilmore, they will say that abolition isn't about abolishing things; it's about creating new things. But often that's not what it feels like. And I think it's not what it feels like often, because if you're in oppositional movements, opposing things seems both more urgent and kind of, I was going to say easier, that's not the right word, but more the thing that has to be done today, the most pressing task. And I think if you look at the kind of academic work on some of these questions, and I plead guilty to this myself, I think academics just sometimes feel much more comfortable in the world of critique than they do in the world of reconstruction and proposing things and exploring kind of possibilities of hope, or the kind of prefigurative moments in our world that kind of suggest that other futures are possible. So I kind of think that, and I was particularly encouraged by both Michelle and Jennifer's talks, because they weren't examples of this kind of thing. They were about some of the kind of the things that are happening in lieu of policing. But I rather think Monica Bell made this point, a rather nice essay on kind of the next phase of police reform, that we need a bit more if you want to kind of make good on a kind of unsettling of the assumption that public safety has to mean policing, then you have to do a bit more work on what public safety might look like without policing.
Thank you very much, Ian. So now we are terribly over time, but with such an engaging conversation, it was absolutely impossible to shut anyone down or not to ask all of the questions in the chat box. So thank you so much, everyone. I really want to thank our amazing speakers. I don't want to sound cheesy, but when you have the best speakers, then you get this kind of conversation. So thank you so much. I really want to thank so much our participants who have stayed with us for 2 hours of engaging thoughts and engaging discussion. This is and this was the first event on our series. We'll have the next one on February 23rd with Kirsti Long from the University of Oslo, talking about the role of NGOs in international criminal justice. Thank you so much again, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.